So that should look good to you, hopefully. Yeah. Okay. So I am going to be talking about basically how philosophical ideas move from one culture to another. And the reason that I am interested in this originally is that a lot of my work, like Deborah's work actually, has been about, in my career, has been about the relationship between Greek philosophy and Islamic philosophy, or as I prefer to say, philosophy in the Islamic world. We can get into that later if you want, but we don't have to. And to a lesser extent, I'm also interested in the relationship between philosophy that was written in Arabic and Latin Christian philosophy, something Deborah works on more than I do, actually. And I think something I've thought basically since I was in graduate school, which is a long time ago now, is that this complicates a traditional story that we still, I think, tend to come across in the presentation of the history of philosophy. Usually when I present this kind of idea, I say, this is probably what you're learning as students in your undergraduate degree, but since you're in Toronto, this is probably not what you're learning. So this will not be news for you. But there is still this widespread idea that the history of philosophy basically goes like this. So there's Greek philosophy, there's Aristotle, and there's Plato, right? And then there's maybe some other people like Augustine might get a look in when people are doing ancient philosophy or medieval philosophy. Mostly though, when we think of medieval philosophy, we think about Aquinas. And then we have modern philosophy here represented by Descartes. And so the idea here is that philosophy is originally a Greek phenomenon. Even the word philosophy, of course, is Greek. And it passes through European history by basically moving through languages, right? So it goes from Greek to Latin to, well, Descartes actually writes in Latin as well. But by the time we get to early modern, we have philosophy written in the vernacular languages. And actually a nice little sign of this is that when I was in grad school at Notre Dame, we were asked to learn 2 foreign languages to study philosophy, at least to the point of being able to like translate a page of text. So a pretty low bar, actually. You had to learn 2 languages though, which is a pretty stiff requirement because Notre Dame, right? And you could choose 2 out of the following 4 languages: Latin, Greek, French, German. Right, so you can even see in that even at Notre Dame, which is a very historically like enlightened department, they're thinking of philosophy as something that starts in Greek, becomes Latin, and then becomes French, German, and English, right? And the point of thinking about the reception of philosophy in the Islamic world is that this is not true, right? Because actually what happens is that philosophy passes from the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's actually not Greece as such. In fact, maybe I should have drawn this arrow as coming from Alexandria, which is really the high point of late ancient philosophy in terms of its impact on the Islamic world. But roughly speaking, we have the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean realm. Its philosophical heritage passes to the Islamic world in the Greek-Arabic translation movement, and then through a further translation movement, which happens in Spain and also in Italy and Sicily and elsewhere. You have Arabic philosophy being translated into Latin and then affecting scholasticism, which is why, for example, when you're reading Descartes' Meditations, you find material that looks like it's inspired by Avicenna. It's not because he's read Avicenna in Arabic, obviously, it's because Avicennan ideas are floating around in the scholastic tradition. And this picture here, simple though it is, kind of represents the way I thought about philosophy for, I would say, the first maybe, let's say 10 to 15 years of my career. So from 2000 when I got my PhD, now I'm giving you the opportunity to figure out how old I might be, but that's okay. So I got my PhD in 2000, and for the first decade or so that I was working in the field, I mostly thought about it in these terms. So Greek philosophy goes into Arabic, Arabic philosophy goes into Latin, and Latin philosophy affects everything in later Western philosophy. So one way to insist upon the importance of philosophy in Arabic is that you can't understand the history of European philosophy without knowing about philosophy in Arabic, which is true, by the way. So I'm not going to say that that's not true. what I am going to say is that it's a partial version of the truth, and that actually, if you think about philosophy moving across cultural boundaries, and by that I'm going to mean really linguistic boundaries, and we'll get into that a lot more, then actually, oh, sorry, so this would just be a representation of the main figures in the story, the revised version. So we start with that with Aristotle, and instead of going from Aquinas to Descartes, we sort of make an end run through Sina or Avicenna and Ibn Rushd of Averroes, and they influence Aquinas, who influences Descartes, right? So it sort of complicates the picture. But now I think that it's more like this. So this is a rather complicated drawing, although it's not complicated enough because I sort of ran out of arrows and space to put them. But the point of this is to show the most important transmissions of philosophical knowledge and doctrines across linguistic boundaries. And really here, I'm only talking about the pre-modern world. Okay, so this is well before globalism, this is before colonialism, all of this stuff that we're so upset about. Here I'm really saying like up until, let's say, 1400, 1500. That's what this picture is supposed to represent. So, and if you kind of squint and look at it, you can see that one point I'm making here is that philosophy doesn't just begin in Greece. It actually begins in three places, namely Greece, or again, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, India, and China. There's an issue about philosophy in other cultures, which may mostly be cultures without writing, like Africa and, let's say, Native American culture. And I'll come back to that in a second. But here I'm just talking about like the three great written philosophical traditions that nowadays basically everyone accepts are genuinely philosophical traditions. So we have Greek, Indian, and Chinese philosophy. They seem to have emerged independently, interestingly, at around the same time. And this is something you all know about because you go to Toronto. And you actually have two of the world's best Indian philosophy specialists now, which is great for you, not at all envious. One of whom is Janardhan Ganeri, who I did the India episodes on my podcast with, and also Eliza Freschi, I guess is how you say her last name, who is also brilliant. So congratulations. So you know all about this. So there's these three kind of independent seats of philosophy. So you know, oops, sorry, that was a mistake. Preview of the next slides because I touched my mouse. But the point I'm making is not just that, it's that once you have philosophy going on in a major written tradition like that, it seems to have a tendency to pass across cultural boundaries. So you have Indian philosophy influencing the Islamic world, and also Indian science. You have it influencing China. You maybe have it influencing ancient Greek philosophy, and I'll talk a lot about that in a minute. And in fact, Indian philosophy kind of radiates out and affects all of Asia, all of Southeast Asia. You have Chinese philosophy, obviously, also moving out and affecting, for example, Korean and Japanese philosophy. You have, for example, philosophy from the Islamic world being transmitted as far as West Africa, where in places like Timbuktu, there are thousands of manuscripts of works on theology, including logic, in Arabic, because Muslims were living there in the late Middle Ages. And of course, you also have the thing I already was talking about, namely the impact of Islamic philosophy on Europe. Okay, so this is a very complicated picture. You might notice there's a lot of arrows in here around the kind of Eastern Mediterranean sphere, and I'll come back to that. Okay, now, so having observed this, or actually just having claimed it dogmatically, a question may arise, which is, how does this happen? And what are we in fact talking about? So when we talk about philosophy passing from one cultural sphere to another, what does that actually mean? And how does it occur? And there are basically two ways, at least in the pre-modern world where there's no internet and no phones. But maybe even in that kind of world, you basically have two choices. You have either written or non-written vectors of philosophy, or we might say written and oral. This is not a hard and fast kind of contrast because written texts, especially pre-modern written texts, were clearly often written in such a way that you were supposed to read them with a teacher who was explaining it to you orally, which is why so many ancient and medieval philosophical texts are so damn hard to read. It's because they're basically notes to prompt the teacher to explain something to you, okay? And in fact, famously, people read aloud a lot in pre-modern cultures, and a lot of the texts that we have are actually going to be texts that were written down on the basis of someone's oral presentation. A lot of people think Aristotle's works are like that. So I'm not saying that there's like a sort of really firm line between written on the one hand and oral on the other, but you can still say that like there's two sort of ways that we could imagine ideas passing from one culture to another. One is the transmission of text, and the other is oral transmission. And oral transmission becomes interesting in a couple of different contexts. One is that you might have a philosophical culture which simply has no written instantiation. And we know that this has existed in many, if not all, ancient cultures. So not a philosophy example, but Homer, right? Homer's poems, if he existed, but the poems that are ascribed to Homer existed for centuries in a purely oral fashion before they were written down. Philosophical example, the Upanishads existed for centuries before they were written down. Also, you could think about Socrates, who is one of the most influential philosophers who's ever lived, yet never wrote anything. So this is everyone's favorite example when they're trying to make a plausible case that philosophy can exist in a purely oral context, right? Well, Socrates never wrote anything, so obviously it can. And this becomes important if you're thinking about, for example, philosophy in pre-colonial Africa, where we don't have any texts preserved from African cultures that were, as it were, untouched or mostly untouched by European cultures from before, say, the 19th, 20th century. But there have been a lot of efforts to use ethnography, archaeology, and other methods to reconstruct the philosophical traditions of, for example, the Akan people who live in West Africa. And the question is, can we figure out what their philosophy of the person is, or their philosophy of time, or whatever? And an obvious kind of challenge to that would be, that doesn't make any sense. There's no philosophical texts, so there's no philosophy. And I do not agree with that. So I absolutely think that philosophy can exist in oral contexts without writing. And we looked at this a lot when we were covering African philosophy in the podcast. So I don't want to voice any skepticism as regarding that, but I am pretty skeptical when it comes to the idea that philosophical ideas pass across cultural, i.e. linguistic boundaries without writing, and in particular without translation. And I want to convince you of that by contrasting two examples. One example is the idea that Indian philosophy, ancient Indian philosophy, influenced ancient Greek philosophy. And then I'm going to compare that to the way that ancient Greek philosophy influenced philosophy in the Islamic world. Okay, so let's start with the question of whether Indian philosophy influenced Greek philosophy. This is something that has been discussed a lot in the literature, as you may be aware of. There's whole books on the subject, and there's a lot to be said about it. But actually, having read a lot of that literature, I'm pretty skeptical about this. And I'm not skeptical because it's prima facie implausible. Actually, prima facie, it's very plausible. And the reasons why it's plausible are complicated, and I don't have time to explain them all. But a few of them would include the fact that there were trade networks connecting ancient India to ancient Europe. So even in texts from ancient Greece, like even before Plato and Aristotle, there are occasional mentions of goods that come from India, so things like spices. In the Roman Empire, if you went down to the docks in Rome, you would have been able to find quite a few goods that had come all the way from Asia. And furthermore, obviously you have not just like empty space between the Eastern Mediterranean and India. You have not only this trade route, but you also have military and political entities, which sort of connect the Indian and Greek spheres. So obvious example would be Alexander the Great's conquests and the Hellenistic kingdoms that he leaves behind. But a less obvious example would be the Persian Empire, which may look like a buffer between India and Greece, but actually could have been a meeting point. So you could imagine like Greek speaking scholars meeting Sanskrit speaking scholars at the Persian court in antiquity. And of course they could trade ideas. So the idea that there could be an oral transmission of philosophical knowledge, doctrines, themes, whatever, from Indian culture to Greek culture or reverse is actually quite plausible. The reason, though, that it has to be an oral transmission is that, as far as we know, there is not a single ancient translation from Sanskrit or any of the other ancient Indian languages like Pali, which would be relevant for the Buddhist tradition. There's not a single translation from an Indian language into ancient Greek or into ancient Latin or into classical Latin in the Roman Empire, as far as I know, at least not for philosophy. So there is certainly knowledge of astronomy and astrology, for example, and Greek astronomy does seem to have been influenced by Indian astronomy, but unless you want to count astronomy as part of philosophy, which I might be prepared to do, but if we're talking about, like theories of the self, metaphysics, epistemology, all that kind of stuff, that doesn't get translated. So it's not that we don't have, it's not that it was translated and that we lack that the texts are gone. It's that, as far as we know, there were never such translations. Okay. So that's why we're talking about oral transmission and not written transmission. Nonetheless, it looks like there are quite a few parallels between Greek and Indian classical philosophy. So, for example, vegetarianism, so you have like very hardcore vegetarianism in Jainism and Buddhism, and then later on in Hinduism, and that's paralleled by vegetarianism among the Pythagoreans. You have monism in Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, which parallels Parmenidean monism. You have atomism in both contexts, and you even have parallel ideas in ancient medicine. So, for example, both Ayurvedic medicine and Hippocratic medicine, especially in the version you find with Galen, it's talk about the humors in the body that are somehow going to be relevant in treating illnesses. So, in the ancient European context, it would be blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So a lot of people have noticed these parallels and said, okay, so there must have been some kind of transmission. Otherwise, we wouldn't find the resonances or these parallels. However, there are also some reasons to doubt this, at first glance, pretty plausible idea. So one thing is that although it's true that there's, like, as I said, there's connecting cultures, like the Central Asian powers that are first dominated by the Persians, then by the Greeks. It's still the case that the actual texts that we have come from either classical India or the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's really far apart. So I got the 3,000 miles figure by literally putting Athens and Delhi into Google and asking it how far apart they are. So that's maybe not the most firm statistic that you could have, but it's still really far, right? Especially in a period where the fastest thing is a horse. So that's a problem, and an obvious problem. I've already mentioned the lack of any translation movement. Another problem, which I think is underestimated, is the extent to which philosophy, as opposed to culture generally, is an incredibly elite enterprise. And this is something that we tend to like to forget. But the percentage of any ancient or medieval people that are literate and engaged in any kind of intellectual labor is really, really tiny. And it's only a tiny percentage of that group of people, who are engaged in creative philosophical work, right? So, I'm not saying that there are only like 10 philosophers from all of antiquity, but we're talking about a total of, probably thousands of people, not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, who wrote philosophical works from from the time of the pre-Socratics down to the time of late antiquity. And there's a parallel situation in India. We get here into tricky questions about what counts as philosophy. Like, for example, is any Buddhist monk automatically a philosopher because they're following the Buddha's teachings? Are Roman gentlemen in the 2nd century AD, around the time of Marcus Aurelius, are they philosophers because they like to live by Stoic precepts? Well, maybe, but what I'm talking about here is kind of like hardcore philosophers who like have classes about philosophy, write texts about philosophy, have a lot to say about it. And if we're talking about that, we're talking about a very small percentage of the population. And in addition to that, we're talking about an extremely elite group of people, not just in the sense that they're rich and that they're free men and not slaves or women. It's also that they are an in-group who don't accept outsiders. And you see this very vividly in the Indian tradition, with lots of stories about, people showing up to study with a master and being made to wait 10 years and prove their patience and endurance before being allowed to even talk to the teacher, right? So, I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but it conveys a kind of ethos that makes it very hard to believe that some random Greek would show up and that the Vedic philosophers would be like, oh, come on in, let me tell you all about my theories of the self. That seems to me extremely unlikely. And in fact, to put a more specific piece of evidence behind that, we know for sure that at the ancient Indian universities, where all of the traditions were actually taught, you had to pass a test even to get in the door. Okay, so Greek visitors who are seen as being like beneath contempt in ancient Indian culture were certainly not the kind of people who would just randomly show up and be taught the intricacies of Vedanta metaphysics. That's not happening for sure. So I think that's a problem for the idea of oral transmission. And something similar is true on the other side, I would say. Like, what do your credentials have to be to get invited into Plotinus's seminar room, right? Well, you kind of have to be a senator. Okay, so that's a problem. Another problem, which I think is actually the worst problem, is that if you look at the supposed parallels more closely, they often kind of fall apart on closer inspection. So just one example, it looks like there's a humoral theory in both medical traditions, but it's the wrong humors. There's only 3 humors in India, and they don't completely line up. And even worse, the humors in Greece are supposed to be held in balance, and they are constituents of the body that are like the ingredients of the body. And the reason why they have to be in balance to make you healthy is that that's what you're made of. Whereas the Indian humors, if I understand them correctly, are more like things that can get loose in your body and cause problems. Okay, so a way of thinking about this is that in the Indian humors are vectors of disease, whereas primarily the Greek humors are vectors of health. It's only when they're out of balance that they cause problems. So whenever you talk about humors in the Indian context, you're talking about an etiology of disease. And that's not true for the humors in the Greek theory. So again, I don't want to be completely skeptical about this. And I want to look at one case, which I think is probably the best, most plausible case for oral transmission of philosophy, which involves this guy here, Pyrrho, who is the founder or putative founder of ancient skepticism. So if you've read Sextus Empiricus, you know that he calls himself a Pyrrhonian. He's a Pyrrhonian skeptic, and his kind of skepticism is modeled on what he thinks this guy Pyrrho was doing. Then the good thing about Pyrrho is that we have biographical information telling us that he went with the army, the Greek army, to India, where he met some naked sophists, gymnosophists, which sound like Indian philosophers. And actually, if they're naked, that would probably mean that they belong to the so-called Shramana movements. In other words, the countercultural dropout, anti-Vedic culture, anti-householder movements, like the Jains or the Buddhists. And it's maybe a little bit easier to believe that a bunch of Greek scholars would have shown up and gotten Buddhists to tell them what they were up to than, let's say, like Nyaya epistemologists or in the Vedic tradition. So everything I was saying about elitism and refusing to teach and so on is much more true for the Vedic schools, I think, than for the Buddhist schools. And furthermore, we then have these nice parallels between Pyrrho and Buddhist philosophy, because Buddhist philosophy is very skeptical. So there's a really startling coincidence, and this really does seem like it's a coincidence, which is that later on, one of my favorite Indian philosophers, Nagarjuna, is exactly simultaneous, more or less, with Sextus Empiricus, the great late ancient skeptic. And Nagarjuna offers these kind of destructive arguments to pull apart dogmatic philosophies of all kinds, and especially Vedic dogmatic philosophies, very much like Sextus does. So this way of doing philosophy in a destructive or skeptical mode seems to be shared between Pyrrho and the Buddhist tradition. So much so that there's a book that was written a few years back by someone named Christopher Beckwith, if I'm remembering that right, where he actually tries to reconstruct early Buddhism on the basis of reports about early Pyrrhonism, just sort of assuming that early Pyrrhonism must reflect Buddhist influence. And since we don't know that much about very early Buddhism, he thinks you can maybe work out what the Buddhists must have been saying by working backwards from what Pyrrho did with their ideas, which is a very bold idea, right? A very bold method. And I think there's something to be said for this. So I think that, there's evidence that Pyrrho may have been inspired by Indian philosophy, and especially by this destructive mode that the Buddhists were apparently quite good at. This idea that he's skeptical because when you judge things, you find that they are no more one way than another way, is something that you find in some Buddhist teachings. But there's a problem, which is that, at least, it's controversial what exactly Pyrrho understood by his skepticism, but as Pyrrhonian skepticism develops later in Sextus Empiricus, it's really a purely epistemic position, which claims that no arguments or judgments have been found on any philosophical question, or maybe even any question whatsoever, but at least on any philosophical question, which are decisive one way or another. And that, of course, is not what the Buddhists think. The Buddhists, by the standards of Sextus Empiricus, are negative dogmatists because they reject the existence of the self, for example. And also they're positive dogmatists, like they accept the existence of suffering, they accept that there's a way to avoid suffering, namely to give up on desire, right? So the Buddhists have a lot of teachings, in other words. They're not skeptics. They have doctrines in a way that Pyrrho clearly didn't, and Sextus Empiricus even more didn't. So what I take from this example is that although cultural exchange in philosophy may be possible, it's likely to be rather superficial or incomplete. So you get a kind of Pyrrho being inspired by ideas from Buddhism, maybe, but you don't get a wholesale importation of Buddhist doctrine, which is why there's no ancient Greek Buddhism. There's just ancient critical philosophy. So this is like a kind of moderate skepticism, appropriately enough, with regard to the possibility of cultural exchange leading to the passage of philosophical ideas across linguistic boundaries. Very much in contrast to that is what happens with Greek philosophy and Arabic, but not just Arabic. And this is something else that I've really come to appreciate only in the last few years, mostly from doing my podcast, which is that Greek philosophy, we all know that it was translated into Latin, like by Boethius in particular, among others, and that it was translated into Arabic. But something that people forget or don't know in the first place, I think, is that those aren't the only languages that Greek philosophy was translated into. Actually, Greek philosophy was translated basically into every literary language that was within striking distance. So not Sanskrit or Chinese, but Latin, Syriac, Arabic, Armenian, Georgian, and Ethiopic, which I'll come back to later. So you can picture that Greek philosophy is being written basically here. So I think you can see my cursor, right? So in Greece, along the coast of Turkey, along here in the modern Middle East. So you have some Greek philosophers from Syria, and of course in Alexandria, where you have the great school, the Library of Alexandria, and the great school of late ancient commentators. So that's where philosophy is being written in Greek, and then also in Rome, like by Plotinus. But then it gets passed on to every linguistic group around there. So, for example, you had this wonderfully named philosopher, David the Invincible, writing commentaries on Aristotle in Armenian. You have a Georgian translation of Proclus. You have Ethiopic translations of popular philosophical works from Greek. And you have Syriac as a really important sort of vehicle for transporting philosophy from Greek into Arabic. Also not to be forgotten is that the Greek philosophical texts are also preserved by being copied in Greek, not only translated, but also copied in Greek, which is a good thing because that's the only reason we have the Greek. So if you go to a library or a bookshop and you pull down a copy of Plato or Aristotle in Greek, what you're looking at there is not based on what Plato and Aristotle wrote, it's based on some Byzantine manuscripts, which were written actually the better part of 2 millennia after Plato and Aristotle lived. So actually what that means is that the legacy of Greek philosophy is this kind of pan-Near Eastern Mediterranean basin phenomenon, and involves all the languages that exist there, at least all the languages that have a literary foothold. Usually the reason they have a literary foothold is because they're somehow involved in a religious tradition. So you have liturgies or translations of the Bible or whatever. Mostly this is Christian, what's going on here. So even the translations into Syriac and then Arabic involve Christians, as I'll say in a second. Okay, so now to focus more specifically on the Greek-Arabic translation movement. As I've just said, it follows on after the Syriac translation movement and involves rich Muslims hiring Christian scholars to translate pagan works into Arabic. And this is something that mostly happens from the late 8th century down to the middle of the 10th century. So it's about 200 years. And this basically overlaps with the high point of the Abbasid Caliphate. So it's really the Abbasids, even the Caliph's own family are involved, but also a whole bunch of aristocrats who are gathered around the Abbasids. With the result that by the time you get to, say, the first half of the 10th century, a philosopher like Al-Farabi or Yahya ibn Adi, who's a Christian philosopher who worked with Al-Farabi apparently, would have been able to read everything in Aristotle that we can read almost. Apparently not the politics, but basically anything you've read by Aristotle, they could have read, but in Arabic translation. They also have not full translations of Plato, but translations of paraphrases of the dialogues, mostly written by Galen, and translations of Neoplatonic works by Proclus and Plotinus. They have lots of math, science, engineering, geography, medicine, you name it. Well, actually not you name it, because they're not very interested in literature, so they don't translate Homer. That's probably why they don't bother translating Plato's dialogues. They think, oh, that's literature, and we don't need that because for philosophy we have Aristotle. But they translate a lot. The way they translate is interesting. So as was observed at the time in the Middle Ages, some of the translations are problematic because they're extremely literal, like almost word for word from the Greek, so that it's hard to understand them if you don't have the Greek in front of you. Sometimes they're very free. So my earliest work, my PhD thesis, was on the Arabic translation of Plotinus, and the entire thesis was about the differences between the Greek version and the Arabic version, which shows you how different it is, right? So it's not just a word here or there. There are whole paragraphs that have been inserted to make it kind of brought up to date for the interest of its audience. So this would actually give you, despite everything I just said about all these kind of minor languages like Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, this would basically give you this idea that Greek philosophy is sort of passed over to the Arabic-speaking world. We have Avicenna and Averroes, who are the most influential figures from the Arabic-speaking world on people like Aquinas, and then we're often running to early modern philosophy. It's a sign of how influential these two guys were that we call them Avicenna and Averroes, which is their Latin medieval names. I mean, their real names are Avicenna and Rusht, but just like we call Confucius, we call them Avicenna and Averroes, Latin names. So again, I don't want to deny that Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd had a huge impact on scholastic philosophy. They clearly did. But I think that it's a big mistake to think of the impact of Ibn Sina, at least, primarily in terms of the Latin-speaking world. Because actually what happens is that he kind of replaces Aristotle as the most important philosopher. So what this means is that anytime after the early 11th century, when Avicenna emerges as this great figure in Central Asia and Persia, anyone who's reckoning with philosophy is dealing with Avicenna and not Aristotle anymore. Averroes here is really an exception, and his great commentaries on Aristotle, impressive though they are in a way a kind of outmoded project, which is still adhering to this idea that philosophy is an engagement, direct engagement with Greek philosophy, as it was back in the heyday of the translation movement in the 10th century in Iraq. I guess the reason why he still thinks this is a good idea is twofold. One is he lives way out in Spain and not in Central Asia where all the action is happening. So he's not in an environment where Avicennism has already swept the board and become the way that everybody thinks. That's one reason. And the other reason is that he knows enough about Avicenna to realize that he really doesn't like Avicenna. And so he's trying to get back to Aristotle and undo the damage. But it doesn't work. He's more influential, Averroes is, than he is sometimes thought in the Islamic world. So it's not like he falls stillborn from the press, as Hume once said, but he's not very influential, whereas Avicenna is incredibly influential. So we have generation after generation of philosophers engaging with Avicenna, writing commentaries on him, writing super commentaries on him, and so on. There's a kind of myth about this, which you may have heard dispelled already, because again, you're in Toronto, which is that philosophy in the Islamic world kind of dies in the 12th century because Ghazali writes this work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which tellingly is an attack on Avicenna, not Aristotle. And then after that, the only thing anyone can think to do is write a whole bunch of commentaries on Aristotle, which is what Averroes does. But everyone else is like, oh, but Ghazali already told us that we don't need to worry about philosophy because it's full of incoherencies. And so after that, all you have is theology and mysticism. So this is deeply wrong. And I sometimes find it kind of funny when people say this, because at the moment I'm with some colleagues of mine, I've been involved in this years-long effort to produce source books of translations of philosophical texts responding to Avicenna from the 12th and 13th centuries. And it's just incredibly complicated, sophisticated technical philosophy, which is very, very much like scholastic philosophy of the 13th and 14th centuries, even to the point of anticipating a lot of the same debates. So for example, if you're familiar with the univocity versus equivocity of being debate, when Duns Scotus and Henry of Ghent and Aquinas go over all that, they are unwittingly just going over territory that had already been covered in the 12th and 13th century in Arabic and Persian. Exactly the same positions, exactly the same arguments. And that's not because these post-Avicennan texts from the Islamic world are influencing people like Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, and Scotus. It's because once you've got Avicenna, there's a sort of certain range of moves you can make philosophically, and all the moves get made in both cultures. And this, what we're working on, is only the first step in charting the post-Avicennan philosophical tradition. It just keeps going and going and going into the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, which is Islamic dominion of India, speaking of cultural exchange between Islamic world and India. So basically what you've got is like a millennium of Avicennan philosophy, so it's the idea that philosophy just kind of died in the 12th century is totally absurd, which obviously raises the question, why did anyone ever think this was true? And the answer is, it's about translations again. So why would you think that Arabic philosophy stops around the end of the 12th century with Averroes, died in 1198, almost exactly on time, right? So it's almost like at his funeral, everyone gets together and says, okay, I guess philosophy is over now. Let's be mystics instead, right? So that seems to be the kind of myth or the idea that you find in older scholarship. And as I say, this is really what I thought when I was in grad school, for example. So this is not that old an idea. And I still run into it quite often. Well, the reason why people thought this is that they looked at Arabic philosophy and what they saw is the stuff that was translated into Latin and impacted upon the Western philosophical tradition. When did the Arabic Latin translation movement happen? Well, the end of the 12th century. So that means that even a philosopher like Fakhruddin Arazi, who's one of the most interesting philosophers of all times from the Islamic world, he lives in the 12th century, but as his name says, he's from Persia, from Rai, and he moves around in Central Asia. His texts are not available in the Mediterranean. They're not translated into Arabic. Sorry, they're not translated into Latin. And so he's totally unknown in Europe. And for that reason, people haven't studied him in European languages until the 20th century, as far as I know, maybe the late 19th century. And so this is kind of a self-inflicted delusion of European culture, which is that philosophy ended in Arabic in the 12th century because all the philosophers who came after that came after the translation movement. So what's happened here is that people have mistaken the moment of the translation movement for a significant moment in the history of Islamic philosophical thought. But actually, the end of the 12th century is no more significant than any other period in the philosophy of the Islamic world. The fact that that's when the stuff was translated into Latin is hugely important for which works make it into the European consciousness, but it has no relevance for the philosophical tradition in the Islamic world. And in fact, the tradition of philosophy from the 12th to the 13th century in Arabic is highly continuous. So the same arguments, issues, even kinds of writing exist in both the 12th century and the 13th century in, for example, Iran or modern day Iran. Okay, so that's actually basically what I wanted to say. And so you can see that the overall point here is we have a contrast between a situation where there's only oral transmission and thus only kind of superficial philosophical exchange, if at all, and a very ambitious translation movement that actually makes all these works available, where you have a massive impact of one culture philosophically on another. And you can even see with the example I just gave of, this thing about Latin, that translations predetermine how one culture sees another culture philosophically. I just want to mention one other thing, mostly just because it's really cool, and I think people should know about it, which is that in late ancient and early medieval Ethiopia, there's this is a Christian, there's a large Christian population at the time, and the Ethiopic church is sort of subordinated to the Egyptian Coptic church. And they write in this language, which I cannot read, called Ge'ez, but it's a Semitic language, like Syriac and Arabic and Hebrew. And even though I'm a specialist of, philosophical translations, I didn't know until I guess about maybe 3 years ago that there's a bunch of Greek philosophical texts that were translated into this language, Ethiopic, or Ge'ez, in late antiquity. I guess the reason I didn't know about it is that it's not things like logical works by Aristotle. It's more like popular, quote unquote, popular philosophical texts, collections of wise sayings, a text called the Physiologos, which is a really interesting Christian text, which talks about animals as kind of symbols of different religious and philosophical ideas. But this is recognizably philosophical material. And in fact, this is probably the kind of material that most intellectuals would have thought of first and foremost when they thought about Greek philosophy in the Near East. So they would have thought of philosophy as like this clever thing Socrates said, like, for example, whatever, you have 2 ears, but only 1 mouth because it's more important to listen than to talk, right? Socrates said that. And then you could sort of bust that out at a dinner party and everyone would be like, oh, very wise, right? And so there were these collections of texts, which, by the way, are a really nice example of the permeability of oral and written culture, right? Because these are things you're supposed to say, like they're witticisms or wise sayings. You're supposed to commit them to memory and then bring them out on a suitable occasion, but then people write them down to transmit them. The most interesting text among these works, as far as I'm concerned, is the Tale of Secundus, which is a massively popular, I mean, this is a popular work of philosophy that was really popular. So it gets translated into many different languages, most of the languages I mentioned before, including Arabic, Latin, and Ge'ez. It's originally Greek, written in the 2nd century, and the Ge'ez version apparently is based on the Arabic version. So this is a translation of a translation. So the plot is, there's this philosopher named Secundus, and as a young man, really as a boy, he's sent off to become a scholar by his family, and he does. Decades later, he's now a young man, he's unrecognizable, and he comes across a book in which it is claimed that all women are whores. And he thinks, that's not plausible. It seems like a gross exaggeration. I know. I will test this proposition that all women are whores by doing the most obvious thing, which is going back to my own homeland, finding my mother, who hasn't seen me in 15 years, and offering her money to have sex with me, which I think we can all agree is not a good plan. And so it proves. So his mother, after some cajoling, agrees to do it. In different versions of the story, they either do or do not actually have sex with each other. So in the Ge'ez version, it's written by Christian monks, so they just lie chastely next to each other all night. But nonetheless, in the morning, he reveals who he is. His mother is shocked, and she runs into the garden and hangs herself. And Secundus is so mortified by this that he resolves never to speak again. So he becomes Secundus the silent philosopher. By being silent all the time, this seems like it might even be supposed to be funny, but if it's not intentionally funny, it's still funny. The fact that he's silent all the time gives him a great reputation for wisdom. And so the king summons him and says, Secundus, tell me your wisdom. And of course, Secundus refuses because he's always silent. And the king says, okay, tell me your wisdom or I'll cut your head off. And Secundus still refuses to speak. And the king is so impressed by his bravery that he lets him off by saying, okay, well, you should just write down your wisdom for me. And Secundus says, okay. No, seriously. Secundus says, sort of nods, and then writes down a whole bunch of wise sayings, and that's the rest of the book. So we get another one of these collections of popular philosophical material. This is obviously, by the way, and some of the sayings are also, as if this weren't all misogynistic enough, some of the sayings are very hostile towards women, which is a clue towards the context in which it was written, right? It's this Christian monastic culture that's supposed to chastise male monks into not seeking the company of women. That's the sort of, perhaps the message of the whole text. But like these other philosophical works, it's a kind of vector for transmitting a lot of philosophical lore, let's say, sometimes including more serious like metaphysical teachings, like say reminiscences of the Neoplatonic hierarchy or whatever. Okay, so I just mentioned that because it's another case of like kind of surprising case of how one culture managed to influence another because of a written translation movement. So here's a couple of sort of conclusions and take-home messages from all of this. One is that if we go all the way back to this picture, so that picture I submit to you makes the whole idea of Western versus Eastern philosophy extremely problematic. Among other things, as I always like to say, Averroes lived further west than Aquinas. So, and he's not the only Muslim or Jewish philosopher to write in Arabic and lives in Spain. So the idea that we have like a kind of firm contrast between Western or even European and non-Western or non-European philosophy is deeply problematic because, especially because of the Islamic tradition, but also some of these other Near Eastern traditions. So like, is Armenian philosophy Western or not? I mean, it's problematic, right? But I think actually there's a deeper problem there, which is that there's a tendency to think of European or Western philosophy as kind of normatively definitive of what philosophy is. Again, philosophy is a Greek word, right? So Greek philosophy gets to be the kind of measure against which we decide whether other things are philosophy or not. And then we often try to justify the study of non-Western philosophy by trying to make a convincing case that you have to know about them in order to understand European philosophy. And like I said, this is how I used to, when I was asked, 15 years ago, if you'd asked me why should people study philosophy in the Islamic world, I would say, well, good luck understanding scholasticism without knowing something about philosophy in the Islamic world, right? And that's not entirely a bad answer. And in fact, I think there are some people who can be motivated to take non-Western philosophies seriously by getting excited about the idea that Indian philosophy influenced Greek philosophy, or that Islamic philosophy influenced European scholasticism or whatever. And I guess what I want to say about this is that although that's true, that those connections do exist, that's actually not the best reason to study these traditions. The best reason to study these traditions is that they're incredibly interesting. So as I like to say, if it's true that Indian philosophy influenced ancient Greek philosophy, that's actually the least interesting thing about it. I mean, the interesting thing about ancient Indian philosophy is just go read the Bhagavad Gita, right? Who cares whether Europeans knew about it before the 19th century? It's unbelievably cool and like deeply, deeply philosophical in all kinds of obvious ways. So I sort of object to this well-meant effort to justify the study of so-called non-Western philosophy by highlighting its impact on Western philosophy. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to say, and this is really what I've been saying throughout, is that although you can have some kind of exchange between linguistic groups or different cultures through oral transmission, I do believe that that can happen. And I certainly believe that philosophy can be transmitted orally within a culture, like I was talking about in the case of Africa. I don't really believe that a major philosophical tradition can kind of be picked up and influence another major philosophical tradition without a huge effort of translation. And actually, I was just thinking today that there might be a kind of analogy here between, on the one hand, the difference between oral and written philosophy, and on the other hand, the difference between handwritten philosophy and printed philosophy. And I'm thinking about this because in my podcast, I'm now up to the Protestant Reformation. So I actually just wrote an episode, which is not out yet, about the impact of the printing press. And I was really struck by the fact that I think if you were going to divide the history of philosophy into just two parts, the parts, at least for European philosophy, you could probably say up till the mid 15th century and after the mid 15th century. In other words, pre-Gutenberg philosophy and post-Gutenberg philosophy. That's the best single bifurcation of philosophy, because the introduction of printing totally changes everything about all intellectual disciplines, including philosophy, in ways that I can't go into right now. But I think that's the level of difference. So the difference between oral and handwritten philosophy is very much like the difference between handwritten philosophy and printed philosophy. Totally different scale, like, I mean, orders of magnitude difference in terms of the power and potential for influence of a body of philosophical thought on later thinkers. Okay, that was like a little less than an hour, so I'll stop now. You did say I could talk for as long as I want, so I took your.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. Okay, so just 1 second.